Hey there, everybody. Welcome to another episode of the Frame Found podcast. I am your host, Chris Tinsley, and for this week's episode, we are going to be talking about the topic of longevity, I guess as it pertains to kind of a professional context. I mean, because this podcast is about, the topic of organizational effectiveness, but also just kind of like drawing parallels to other things in life. And I don't know, it's just... this is a topic that I feel like comes up in other parts of my life, and it applies within a professional context too. So I figured, why not just kind of explore it? Kind of changing the format of the podcast a little bit, where instead of kind of doing like three distinct sections of the podcast with an opening and a closing and all that, kind of just drafted up, with the help of chat. Just kind of like prompting questions, maybe about 10 or 12 of them, just to kind of like rapid fire through and just kind of see what thoughts come from that. My goal is to kind of try to keep these episodes a little bit shorter in length. It's going to be a little bit interesting because I do tend to tangent and kind of like that too. But I don't know, I'm just going to kind of see how this goes. So let's just jump into the first question. So what do I mean by longevity at work? What I mean by that is being able, professional life is demanding, and it's really important to take time to recover so that you can continue to, rise to the expectations of your role, and also just for you to personally grow. I was contemplating a lot about this, and I don't know. I feel like maybe I'm kind of overthinking it, and just feel like I just want to kind of speak kind of what's on my mind. But really, where this came from was, again, a jiu-jitsu kind of analogy, kind of like a parallel there. I'm sure this might be in some of the other questions in here, but I kind of just feel like I'm in kind of a flow right now, so why not just kind of explore? I think, and I'll kind of draw a line through on the overall thought, but longevity, I think, is something that doesn't get spoken a lot about in a professional context, and it's been very interesting over the past few years, or I guess maybe a decade or so, of the fitness trackers. Like, for instance, I'm wearing a Whoop. There's a bunch of other trackers out there, but just, I guess what I'm just trying to say is that it's interesting, since the kind of invention of them, that people are starting to understand the relationship between strain and recovery, and just looking at it from kind of a performance lens, that if you're going to put yourself through, high strain, right, in a physical sense, right, then it's important that there's an equal amount of recovery associated to that, so you can continue to perform at a, at a high level, or at whatever level you want. I don't know, I just thought that was kind of an interesting thing. It was an interesting observation. And I just kind of think it's interesting to kind of look at that from a professional context. Like, the first thing that comes to mind is when you're doing certain, cognitively heavy work, right? It's sometimes good to mix it up with brain dead kind of work, right? Like stuff that doesn't really take a whole lot of thought, just to kind of change things up, where you kind of have a moment of, strenuous activity, but then you kind of mix it with active recovery. And I just think, again, just kind of an interesting topic. I'm feeling myself starting to rant, so I'm just going to move on to the next question and just see, boom, how quickly I can move through all of these. Why do most workplaces only understand strain? I don't know. I think when I read that question out loud, it might just be, I don't know if the proper term is like post-modernism, or I guess the thing that comes to mind is, I don't know, maybe since the Industrial Revolution of the 20s, right? just if we look at Henry Ford and the invention of the assembly line, right, and being able to kind of measure a worker's output relative to, amount of parts assembled on this assembly line, multiply that by an 8-hour day. You can find ways to measure efficiency or progress or whatever you want to call it. And that's important. You do need to be able to do that. And I think maybe, I don't know, that's what comes to mind. Or I guess the reason why I want to do this episode is because over the past 10 years, when it comes to from a fitness lens, that people are just starting to understand the relationship between strain and recovery. And I just think that that's interesting. So I just think that maybe the professional space just hasn't caught up with that yet, or maybe it's going to turn a corner of sorts. I don't know, but that's just, top of mind thought, I guess. But let's just move on to the next one and just kind of see, what else we can kind of uncover, on this topic. Why is recovery almost never treated as part of performance? Again, I think it's the reason why I wanted to do this episode. I just think it's new in a fitness sense. I think people always knew. I think that coaches and trainers always knew that recovery was always a necessary thing. But I think now that, again, with all these apps and these tools and, things like a Whoop band or like an Apple Watch or whatever, right? Like people now it's empirical, I guess. Like it can be measured. Yeah, I don't know. Let's just keep going on the questions. What does physical training understand that work still misses? There's kind of a sub point here of strain only works if recovery is part of the cycle. And I don't know, we've already kind of touched on that. So it's like, I think people are just starting to understand the relationship between these two concepts. So let's move on to the next one. What happens in jiu-jitsu or training when you keep pushing without recovery? You just get wrecked. Your body will just break down when I look at that from a physical sense. And I think part of the reason why maybe I wanted to do this episode was because, I've always been into training of sorts, like at one point it was strength training and, a certain kind of like CrossFit sort of like sense, I guess. But with jiu-jitsu, it's demanding on your body in kind of a different way with, I don't know, your joints and your tendons and your muscles, and you're using them in different ways. And it's just really important, at least in that context, is that because when you have a training day of sorts, it puts a lot of strain on your body, especially when you're going up against heavier and stronger opponents. And that's why I make it a point that, I'll have a day of training and then the next day is a recovery day. And it's always like some sort of active recovery. It could be like weight training, strength training, and in a very light sense, just to kind of keep everything open. But I definitely stretch, ice, protein intake is super important just from that sounds like such a bro-y thing to say. That was not my intent on that one. It's just you need to be able to take care of your body, and protein is a building block of that, right? So watching like what you eat, how you hydrate, how you sleep, these are all things that contribute to recovery. And if you don't take them in mind, if you don't keep them in mind, you can expect for your performance to really drop. And if you really don't watch it, you run the risk of an injury. So let's just move on to the next question, because I feel like I'm going down a rabbit hole on that one. Why do so many professional environments still work that way? And this is in the context of the previous question. So it's like, what happens in jiu-jitsu training when you keep pushing without recovery? Professional environments. Okay, so I guess what this question is really trying to get at is, I don't know, I feel like I already answered this. Let's just move on to the next one. What does overstrain look like at work? the term burnout, I feel like, is a very subjective, arbitrary kind of term. But like how overstrain looks at work, I mean, for me personally, within a professional lens, and I've seen it with a bunch of clients and colleagues, there's a brain drain. There's kind of like there's a brain fog. Um, when maybe I should do another episode about this, but I think the term is executive function, and I believe that is the term. And it has to do with a human being is only able to make so many choices each day. And, once you surpass a certain amount, once you surpass a threshold, your ability to make good choices significantly drops to the point where, making it, you may not even have the ability to make any choices at all. And I think that's the way that, at least within a knowledge work kind of context or sense, that's kind of how it comes up. I think that, but also equally as much too, like if I look in my professional life at the past, what was once strenuous or overstrain, now in hindsight just looks like a cinch. It's just easy. So it's not to say that, like, however I'm feeling right now, or just generally speaking, that's not going to change in a decade from now, where I could very easily look back and go, hey, that time, that was a cinch. I feel like that could be a whole other separate episode, but I guess to really bring this question home, what it looks is, I feel like it's just brain fog or like brain drain. I think that's the first thing that comes to mind. And I feel like I could explore this question even more, but for the sake of just kind of keeping this flowing and moving and kind of exploring other parts, let's just move on to the next question. Why is this becoming easier to see now? Okay, so that's relative to the previous question. I already kind of mentioned this. One of the sub notes here is that fitness trackers gave people language for strain and recovery. So I think, again, this is kind of the reason why I wanted to do this episode was, that's kind of the reason why, is because that's also what I observe too, where it's just, this is new from a fitness perspective, and I think we could learn from it. I already answered this next question. I'm just going to skip it. Or actually, okay, let's maybe explore this question. So why is work still behind on this? It just hasn't caught up yet. I mean, that's the only thing that comes to mind. Like, we just discovered this or not like a discovery, but like a newfound appreciation for this stuff in a fitness sense. It's going to take some time for it to turn the corner from a professional sense. I don't know. I just think, as I'm kind of looking back at, this episode and kind of the questions that we've been exploring, as it's almost like, what are some tools, or like, what are some ways what does recovery look like in the sense of a professional context? I think, I don't know. There's productivity apps and tools like time blocking and GTD, and I think it's the Pomodoro technique, where it's like 20 minutes on and 5 minutes off or whatever. Like, those are all, I guess, like means for, not really like recovery. That's more so like productivity and planning. The Pomodoro technique, I guess, is kind of a form of recovery, but I don't know. I mean, for me, if I'm doing something that's brain draining, I need to mix it up with something that's, easier to do, and I get a dopamine hit for completing a task, right? I think that's really important. I think as I kind of look back at, clients and colleagues, I guess maybe that is kind of a common theme that is coming up, is that people just feel they're not getting anything done, or they're not making any progress. And I think we as human beings, it's really important. I think maybe I talked about this in a previous episode. Maybe not. But it's like, it's just really important that we have a sense that progress is being made on whatever. Um, I guess I'm realizing now I touched on it. I didn't touch on it specifically in a previous episode, but I had an analogy of, taking a trip up to the summit of a mountain. And that was regarding, the topics of efficiency and effectiveness. But with that same kind of analogy in mind, right, it's really important that as you're going on a journey like that, that the summit of the mountain gets closer and closer. It's important for you as a human being to be able to see that and understand that. So it becomes a driving force that, like, hey, you're making progress, let's keep going, right? But if the goalpost continues to extend, or kind of like the extending hallway, so to speak, then that can kind of create some, arguably unnecessary strain. Or it's not really unnecessary strain. It's just important to see progress. I think that's a good way of recovery. Damn, I just went on a full-on tangent. I just realized I hit so many other topics. So let me walk this one back. I don't know. I think I'm just understanding now that maybe I want to do another episode about what specifically, like, what are some recovery protocols, so to speak, within a professional sense. But anyways, let's just try to bring this home, or bring this episode home. Yeah, actually, well, I already, I told you guys I, worked with chat on this outline, and I realized it just drops off right there. I guess the ending question is, what's the real point? So that's the prompting question here. And the subnote here, and I do agree with it, is recovery is not separate from performance. It is part of performance. Yeah, I totally agree with that. It's in everything that, was in the previous answers to these questions. They go hand in hand, and I think that we are learning that. We've learned that from a fitness perspective, and I think it's just a matter of time until it catches up from kind of like a professional perspective. I don't know. I think it's really interesting, heading, deeper and deeper into 2026 and all of the advancements in AI. I think it's causing a good amount of strain on people's brains, because they're having to think about how to solve problems in a different way, but then also how to use tools in a different way. And I think even then, so when you know how to use those tools, and you do have good ideas, that also creates strain in and of itself, because all the options and the permutations just, they're off the charts. And I think, that's very exciting. But it's a scary thing. To say that it's a scary thing is kind of extreme. My point is that more now than ever, I feel like we need to get a better understanding of what it means to recover in a knowledge base, or in a knowledge base workplace. I think, I don't know. It's possible to, I think about all of the possibilities of what the future can hold, and the amount of work that comes along with that. And it's all possible to do, but it's very taxing, and it's really important that we understand what recovery truly means. So maybe I'll kind of explore that in another episode. And my daughter has just woken up from a nap, so that's going to be my off-ramp for this episode. Guys, thank you so much for checking out this episode of the Frame Found podcast, and I'll add in some links, whether they're here or wherever, whatever side, to some other episodes for you to check out. And I will see you guys all on next week's episode. Thank you very much.